A 70-year legacy continues. Welcome. We're taking another look into the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot, who called us to live to a higher standard each day, to not be satisfied with just a little empty religion in life, a shallow substitute for what we could have. Our series continues in the coming weeks as we hear from family, friends, and others influenced by the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. Hey, thank you for joining us. A special look back today. Recently, we marked the 70-year anniversary of the day the 5 men were killed in their efforts to reach out to eventually, they hoped, share the gospel with a tribe known commonly as the Aucas, also known as the Waodani. We'll go back to early reports of what happened, but who were these 5 men who died? We'll think about that today. We'll also hear from another veteran missionary as he talks about the legacy of those 5 men. We'll hear from the daughter of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, Valerie Elliot Shepard, who will talk about the shocking death and that they knew Jim might not come back alive. And what about Elizabeth? She may have told the story hundreds or thousands of times. What did she learn from Corrie ten Boom about the story that God gives us? Well, first we go back to a record album actually. It's called the Auca Story. The producer, the one who collected the interviews and much of the information, was Nancy Wollnow, a missionary who earlier had written dramatic children's radio stories, The Adventures of Raindrop. Her words to close out her radio broadcasts were, "Keep your heart tender toward God." Well, missionary Nancy Wollnow compiled information and as part of a record called the Auca Story. And we're going to hear an excerpt from that album. It talks about the 5 men. Who were they?
This is the Auca Story. Up to this point, we have told you the background of reaching the Auca tribe of Ecuador for the Lord. We have recounted for you how 5 American missionaries, Nate Saint, Ed McCully, Jim Elliot, Roger Udarian, and Pete Fleming, prayed and prepared to meet the Aucas. They did meet them on January 6, 1956.
Concerned people all over the world tune to their local radios and television sets, plus shortwave, to obtain information. Christians in Ecuador and in every corner of the world prayed and waited along with the 5 wives. Here is a contact with the National Broadcasting Company of New York City on January 13th at 7 a.m.
How's our signal up there now? Does it seem to be okay?
Yes, I don't hear the music, so go ahead, Doctor.
Right. The bodies of 4 of the 5 missionaries missing since last Sunday in the jungles of Ecuador were found late yesterday afternoon near their small damaged plane. The brave wives of the 5 men have all been brought to Shelmera to await the final developments expected within the next few hours. Clarence Jones of 8CJB Quito returning you to NBC New York.
And then Friday afternoon at 4:45 p.m., Dr. Jones presented this bulletin.
Today, it has definitely been established that all 5 missionary men were killed. Bodies have been buried at the place where they were found.
And such were the radio bulletins that were flashed around the world. How to inform the wives was the question uppermost in the minds of everyone concerned. How should they be told? And while they pondered, the wives themselves persuaded the military men and the physician present that there was no need to soften the blow. They wanted to know everything. Major Nuremberg opened his notebook and, in terse sentences, described what he had found. The 5 women there in Chalmeta, along with their children, heard the news in the Saint home. They met the information with a serenity that was supported by their depth of trust and confidence that all things work together for good. When the ground party arrived back in Chalmeta, the women gathered in the kitchen of Marge Saint's home.
We were already trying to adjust ourselves to the use of the word widows, and as we sat there, Dr. Art Johnson was describing the finding of the bodies. It was evident that death had been caused by lance wounds. Naturally, the question came to our mind, why, after the overtures of friendship on Friday, had the Aucas turned with such sudden and destructive anger on their white visitors on Sunday? The answer to this could only be guessed. But this much we knew, whosoever shall lose his life for my sake in the Gospels, the same shall save it. There was no question as to the present state of our loved ones. They were with Christ. And once more, ancient words from the Word of God came to mind. All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way, though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons, and covered us with the shadow of death.
The last of the special bulletins was sent around the world by shortwave from the Voice of the Andes on Saturday, January 14th, 1958. Now the world knew, and Christians and non-Christians alike were saddened by the news. During memorial services held in Ecuador, missionary colleagues recalled to mind the 5 young men and their wives.
There were no finer missionaries in Ecuador than Nate, Ed, Jim, Roger, and Pete. They were key men in the gospel ministry in this country. Take Nate Saint, for instance. He brought to Ecuador the very best of spiritual and technical training. Those of us who have flown with him can testify that a more careful, diligent pilot could never be found. He was a missionary pilot, with the emphasis on missionary. Wherever he went, people felt the impact of the spiritual power that his life constantly produced. I remember last May when he preached in Spanish at the church where I'm pastor here in Quito. His opening remarks were more or less like this: "Friends, this is ridiculous for me to be occupying a pulpit. I'm only an aeroplane mechanic acquainted with valves, spark plugs, bolts, and nuts." And then he promptly proceeded to preach far better than most of us who dedicate our full time to preaching. For 6 years, he was constantly flying his small Piper aeroplanes over the endless green carpet of the Ecuadorian jungle. And his ministry completely transformed missionary work in the jungle. Prior to his coming to Ecuador 6 years ago, missionaries spent a distressing percentage of their time struggling on the trails, getting worn out and weary in the battle of going from one place to another. But Nate changed all that. With his missionary plane, he transported his fellow missionaries to any spot in the jungle in 20, 30, or 40 minutes, and they arrived at their destination, well rested, ready to begin immediately their duties. And then every week he would drop out of the sky at each mission station with foodstuffs, medicines, mail from home, and other provisions. As a result, all missionary work had a tremendously enlarged impact and growth. Nate Saint transformed the jungle. He died at the age of 32, a young man in the prime of life. Jim Elliot was 4 years younger than Nate when he suffered martyrdom a week ago today. He had spent 4 years in the jungle, and he spoke both the Quechua and Spanish languages with excellent fluency. I'll never forget a message he brought to the young people of our church a little over a year ago. I can remember him saying, "Young men and women, I challenge you to accept gospel responsibility out in the jungle. I don't offer you anything of comfort. I don't offer you anything of convenience or good salary. I offer you sacrifice and toil, perhaps tears and maybe broken health. But I offer you the opportunity of being a blessing to multitudes of the dwellers of the forest. And they responded to his challenge. 17 of them. 17 of the finest young people we have here in our gospel churches in Quito. Ed McCully was also a young man of 28 years. My, what an abundance of talents he possessed. In his senior year at Wheaton College, he participated in the oratory championship for all of the country. Representatives from all the universities and colleges of the United States of America took part, and Ed was the champion. As a musician, he was frequently heard on our HCJB programs when he would come to Quito playing his trombone with beautiful interpretations. Then about 6 months ago, he and his wife established a new mission station in the jungle, the place called Arajuna. The new work met with a most amazing success, wherein many missionaries had toiled for years before having their first fruits at their particular stations. The McCullys had the joy of seeing most of the Indians of that newly opened area immediately responding by attending the Bible classes. And that station was the nearest to the Auca tribe. And perhaps the Aucas were nearer to Ed's heart than anyone else's. Pete Fleming was the youngest of the 5, having turned 27 last November. Those of us who attended the retreat of the Intermission Fellowship last May will continue to remember what a splendid job he did as program director for that 4-day conference. Then this evening, I was out at a mission station called Calderon, just a half an hour to the north of Quito. I brought about 40 or 50 of the Indian boys and girls from that station back to our church, where they sang a number of gospel choruses. As we made the trip, the entire topic of their conversation was Pete Fleming. My, how they loved him. He had conducted an evangelistic campaign among their clan last spring, preaching in their Quechua language. They talked about him and they sang the choruses that he had taught them. Jim, Ed, and Pete belonged to the group known as Christian Missions in Many Lands, more commonly referred to as the Plymouth Brethren. They were great Bible students, all 3 of them. Each of the 3 have been heard on the Call of the Andes broadcast through this station, having the responsibility of a series of 1 month each. Roger Udarian belonged to the Gospel Missionary Union. He would have been 32 this month. He had worked among a tribe of Indians known as the Jivaros in the southern jungle of Ecuador. And then this past year, he and Frank Drown had the joy of taking the gospel to a tribe that had never heard before, namely the Ashuaras. That's a drama in itself. We are especially indebted to him because of the way he directed the construction of the hospital that is being built down at Chalmera. As a soldier of the American Army, he'd seen a great deal of action during the Second World War out in the Pacific area with the Japanese. My, what a good soldier he was for Christ as he gave his life for the greatest cause in the world last Sunday.
A very touching incident occurred when Mrs. Faith Turner told of accompanying the 5 women over the site of Palm Beach.
It was a time of fellowship, and the presence of the Lord was so very sweet. As we circled over the spot and looked down upon the little tombstone, the sister of Nate Saint said, "There is no more beautiful tombstone than that little plane, stripped of its mantle of wings at the spot where the bodies were laid." We prayed. Just as the plane had circled and left the spot, the wives laid their heads on the bare windows of the plane. And as we commended ourselves along with thanksgiving to God for the dear ones whose bodies lay below us, "Thy will be done," and praise to God, one of the wives said, "They lost the battle, but won the victory."
That's from the record The Auca Story, produced by missionary Nancy Wollnow. In a little bit, we'll be hearing from Elizabeth as she talks about what she learned from Corrie ten Boom about the story God gives each of us. Right now, veteran missionary Frank Kollinger has some thoughts on the legacy of the 5 missionaries who were killed, and about the first time that he heard of their deaths.
It has borne fruit, obviously, because there are several Auca people who are sincerely saved and wanting to live for the Lord. Now, at this conference that I attended in 2006, we got word from some of the older Aucas who were around when the men were killed that they're faithful, but they're concerned about the younger generation, who they put into their language, they're not walking God's trail like we did or we are doing. So they're concerned about the younger generation, not really too different than any of us here in the United States, wondering about the younger generation, our own children, grandchildren, etc. So that I noticed when I was on that trip. There are some, good believers among them, and as I noticed throughout the jungle, there's many among Quichuas and even the other Shuar and not Shuar language groups, which is to the south. That's where Roger Udarian was ministering, and in all of these areas, there are groups of believers meeting together and faithful to the Lord, and all, I say the various groups are local churches among them in all sizes and shapes of spiritual maturity. So, but at least they do have the gospel, and most of these places are on their own now because there's no foreign missionaries in these places.
Tell us about the first time you heard about Jim and the other missionaries being killed. Do you remember that first time you heard about it?
Oh, yes, I do, because I was in high school. I was 15 years old, and I remember it made big news in St. Louis. The paper, in fact, I still have some of those newspaper articles about the killing. And Jim and, let's see, it would have been Ed, I think it was Pete Fleming, one of the others, and Jim visited our home church. Of course, the three of them, Jim, Ed, and Pete, were all from a Plymouth Brethren background, and that's my background, so that made a lot of news and information about them in our circles.
Veteran Ecuadorian missionary Frank Kollinger. Later on, we'll hear from Jim and Elizabeth's daughter, Valerie, Elliot Shepard, as she talks about the shocking death that actually was not a complete surprise in the sense that they knew it could happen. That coming later. We've gotten together over 200 times already, and during that time we've recounted the story of the lives and the deaths of the 5 men. Plus, we've heard from their wives. We've heard from Elizabeth and Valerie about living with the Aucas. Actually, we've spent about 50 programs in one series alone, but you may have heard Elizabeth refer to that in many other programs as well. Well, as today we gaze back 70 years to think about their sacrifice of those 5 men and their families, we think about the very story itself. Elizabeth once talked to Corrie ten Boom. We'll hear about Jim's testimony about being led to the work on the foreign mission field. Even going out for the wrestling team had a spiritual element for Jim. This is called God Gave You That Story.
A few years ago, when I was living in Hamilton, Massachusetts, I heard that Corrie ten Boom was scheduled to speak at Gordon College, which is in the next town. I was thrilled and made up my mind to block that out on my calendar and get myself a ticket for the banquet. And I hoped very fervently that Corrie ten Boom would tell the story of her years in concentration camp. But then I thought, poor Corrie, that's more than 30 years ago. I'm sure the whole world expects to hear that story. She must get rather sick of telling it. Maybe she'll talk about something else. Well, to my amazement and delight, she spoke about exactly that, the story of her capture and imprisonment in concentration camp in Germany. And afterwards, to my even greater amazement and delight, I was privileged to have tea with her several days later. And so I told her of my feelings, and I said, "Do you ever get tired of telling your story? Does it ever embarrass you to think that maybe your listeners will say, 'Has Corey got nothing else to talk about?'" And she laughed, and she said, "Yes." She said, "I have felt that way. And one day I spoke to the Lord about it. I said, 'Lord, I must have something fresh.' And the Lord said, 'Corey, that is the story I gave you. You tell that story.'" Well, God has given you a story, too. Perhaps you won't have the opportunity to go all over the world and tell yours as Corey told hers. Maybe you won't write any books about it. But it's a story. And someday we may discover that yours was much more important than some of the stories which we have thought of as being the most important in God's sight. It says in the first chapter of Ephesians, "In Christ, God chose us before the world was founded, to be dedicated, to be without blemish in His sight, to be full of love. And He destined us, such was His will and pleasure, to be accepted as His sons through Jesus Christ, in order that the glory of His gracious gift, so graciously bestowed on us in the Beloved, might redound to His praise." I'm convinced that God's destiny for you and me is love. Sometimes it's much easier to see the hand of God in someone else's story than in our own. Do you find that difficulty? Can you look back on the story of your life and see the hand of God? Can you see His love in every chapter? I'm sure that some of you are listening to this and saying, "Every chapter? If you knew my life, you wouldn't even suggest that the love of God was evident in every chapter." Is it easier for you to see His will at work in somebody else's life? When it's a complete book and the story is finished, perhaps it's easier. The pattern then begins to emerge, and it becomes understandable, at least to a point. That's one of the reasons why I love biographies. You can see the whole pattern from beginning to end, and you can understand in some measure the reasons for earlier events and how they led on in preparation to later events. It's not so easy when we look at the story of our own lives. I want to tell you the story of 5 men, missionaries in Ecuador back in the 1950s. I was an intimate part of that story, having been the wife of one of those men. And my first book, Through Gates of Splendor, begins with 2 of them. I'd like to read you the first couple of pages of that book. The Santa Juana is underway. White stars breaking through a high mist, half moon, the deep burn of phosphorus running in the wake, long, easy rolling in the push of steady wind. It was hot in the little cabin of the freighter. Jim Elliot, who was later to become my husband, was writing in the old cloth-covered ledger he used for a diary. It was a night in February 1952. Pete Fleming, Jim's fellow missionary, sat at a second desk. Jim continued, "All the thrill of boyhood dreams came on me just now outside, watching the sky die in the sea on every side. I wanted to sail when I was in grammar school and well remember memorizing the names of the sails from the Merriam-Webster's ponderous dictionary in the library. Now I'm actually at sea, as a passenger, of course, but at sea nevertheless, and bound for Ecuador. Strange, or is it, that childish hopes should be answered in the will of God for this now? We left our moorings at the outer harbor dock, San Pedro, California, at 2:06 today. Mom and Dad stood together, watching at the pier side. As we slipped away, Psalm 60, verse 12, came to mind, and I called back, 'Through our God we shall do valiantly.' They wept some. I do not understand how God has made me. Joy, sheer joy and thanksgiving fill and encompass me. I can scarcely keep from turning to Pete and saying, "Brother, this is great," or "We never had it so good." God has done and is doing all I ever desired, much more than I ever asked. Praise, praise to the God of heaven and to his Son Jesus, because he hath said, "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee." I may boldly say, "I will not fear." Jim Elliot laid down his pen. He was a young man of 25, tall and broad-chested, with thick brown hair and blue-gray eyes. He was bound for Ecuador, the answer to years of prayer for God's guidance concerning his life work. Some had thought it strange that a young man with his opportunities for success should choose to spend his life in the jungle among primitive peoples. Jim's answer, found in his diary, had been written a year before. "My going to Ecuador is God's counsel, as is my leaving Betty." Betty was the name that he called me. "And my refusal to be counseled by all who insist that I should stay and stir up the believers in the U.S. And how do I know it is his counsel? Yea, my heart instructeth me in the night seasons. How good, for I have known my heart is speaking to me for God. No visions, no voices, but the counsel of a heart which desires God." I had known Jim back when he was a student at Wheaton. I remember that he was one of the more visible students on the campus, what we used to call a BTO, a big-time operator, or a BMOC, big man on campus. Jim was the president of the Foreign Missions Fellowship and therefore considered a spiritual leader, a guy who used to go around grabbing friends and saying, "Hey, buddy, how come you're not going to the mission field?" Or in the dining hall line, at times, he would grab somebody by the shoulder or the arm and he'd say, "What did you get from the Lord this morning, sister?" He was not only a spiritual leader, he was a campus clown, the sort of person that could be called upon without warning, and he would stand up and do some comedy, some reciting of Robert Service's poetry, such things as "A Face on the Barroom Floor" or "The Shooting of Dan McGrew." He was also a wrestler, and he put down in his diary the reason why he went out for wrestling. He said, "I wrestle solely for the strength and coordination of muscle tone that the body receives while working out, with the ultimate end, that of presenting a more useful body as a living sacrifice. This God knows, and even though he chose to allow it to be strained, the motive was for his glory and the faith he honors. Simplicity of heart and freedom from anxiety he expects of us, and gives grace to have both." I think he had received some sort of a minor injury, and his mother was very worried about that, and so he gave her a similar explanation for his going out for wrestling. Besides being a spiritual leader and a campus clown and an athlete, he was also a good student. He wrote in a letter to his parents in 1947 something which reveals where his ambition lay. "The Lord has given me a hunger for righteousness and piety that can alone be of himself. Such hungering he alone can satisfy, yet Satan would delude and cast up all sorts of other baubles: social life, a name renowned, a position of importance, scholastic attainment. What are these but the objects of the desire of the Gentiles, whose cravings are warped and perverted? Surely they can mean nothing to the soul who has seen the beauty of Jesus Christ. No doubt you will hear of my receiving preliminary honors at school. They carry the same brand and will lie not long hence in the basement in a battered trunk beside the special gold B pin with the ruby in it for which I studied 4 years at Benson. All is vanity below the sun and a striving after wind. Life is not here, but hid above with Christ in God, and therein I rejoice and sing as I think on such exaltation." He was a good student, conscientious, probably not a genius, but he studied hard, and he graduated with highest honor in classical Greek. And he wrote this: There is no such thing as attainment in this life. As soon as one arrives at a long-coveted position, he only jacks up his desire another notch or so and looks for higher achievement, a process which is ultimately suspended by the intervention of death. Life is truly likened to a rising vapor, coiling, evanescent, shifting. May the Lord teach us what it means to live in terms of the end, like Paul, who said, "Neither count I my life dear unto myself, that I might finish my course with joy."
That was called God Gave You That Story. Elizabeth and Jim's daughter Valerie spent time in Ecuador as a young child, and she reminisced about whether or not this was something her parents had considered, that her dad might not come back alive.
My father's death, of course, that story of the 5 men being killed went around the world and was a shock to thousands and thousands of people. And yet, this is what he had said: "Lord, if my life could be a short life on earth, then may the zeal for you consume me." As my mother carried on the missionary work with the Quichuas, do you know what she said to my father as he left to go to the Aucas? She said, "What will I do if you don't come back?" And he said, "Teach the believers, darling. Teach the believers." She did that the rest of her life.
Valerie Elliot Shepard. Hey, do you remember the first time you heard about the missionaries who were killed? What kind of an effect did it have on you? Well, maybe you'd like to tell us about it. Maybe you have a comment on something else that you've heard. Well, you can visit us at elizabethelliot.org. Go to Resources, then Podcast, and then you'll see a place to share your story and your message to us. I'd recommend you take out your phone and find us there at elizabethelliot.org so you can leave a message for us. Go to Resources, Podcast, and then share a message with us. Thanks. Well, thanks for letting us come along with you as you took that walk, or maybe we found you at home or at the office. On behalf of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, remember to check out all the resources at elizabethelliot.org. More talks, devotionals, videos, and more. Until next time, may God remind you each day you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms.
Kushi Mushu Wata. That means Happy New Year. 3 words in Quechua. Kushi Mushu Wata.